Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're tuning in to watch this. We wanted to, first of all, just touch base, say hello, say that we miss being in Sunday school with you. We look forward to a time where we will all be together again in MPC. But we wanted to give you a little bit of material to engage with in these times. So Drew and I are going to talk a little bit today about how Christians have engaged in time of crises in the past. But first of all, we wanted just to kind of touch base and offer you an opportunity to check in with each other, give each other a call, send an email just to see how you're doing. But Drew, how are you doing? How has this past couple of weeks been for you, Brittany, and the kids?
It's been an interesting couple of weeks. We have gone through the transition now of moving all of our PBA responsibilities to online formats. So that's teaching classes and meeting in committees and all of that via Zoom, which it isn't too difficult, honestly. The Zoom stuff is kind of fun in a certain respect. It's a new thing. It can get a little bit difficult because the kids are kind of diving in and out of Zoom calls pretty regularly, which it just makes it interesting, and people like seeing the kids. It's not really a problem, but yeah, just that transition and trying to help students through what is a very sort of chaotic and uncertain time for them. I feel particularly for our seniors at PBA who are now finishing up their time of college in this sort of environment, which is really difficult. And PBA just made the decision to postpone or cancel May commencement ceremonies. So that's got to be disappointing for a lot of seniors. Yeah. How are things for you?
Yeah, it's just kind of a bizarre, it feels like a hurricane, but there's no cone of certainty. There's just impending doom for all of us at times, it feels like. Yeah. So it's difficult to kind of get out of the existential crisis headspace and to kind of focus on a very different sort of daily, weekly rhythm. And also, my family in Scotland, they've been on lockdown for a while. But I've also been checking in with them more. So I feel that a lot of what we've talked about in Sunday school has been about kind of rhythm, rest, busyness, work, and I feel like in rather unexpected ways, this season has given me an opportunity to be a lot more still and a lot more present and give me more time to work on things that I've, writing projects I've held off on for a while. So in a weird way, it's been some parts of this have been nice. That has felt slower. I felt more connected to friends. I've spoken to my family more often, but then it does just feel like a very disconnected space to really engage with the global scale of what's going on just now.
Yeah, I definitely have that sense of the anxiety sort of coming in waves. I don't know if people are feeling that at home as well, but that sort of anxious dread sometimes just hits you, and I have to sit down and it's stop doing whatever I'm doing, and then most of the time I feel like I can get on with a little bit of a rhythm and find a new way of doing things, and then sometimes it's oh man, this could be a few more weeks, this could be a few more months, I don't know, just that uncertainty hits in waves.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very much so. So in that regard, we wanted to kind of talk to you guys and girls a little bit today about historical instances of how Christians have responded to crises, global crises, local crises in the past. And there's sort of, there's ancient examples, there's medieval examples, and there's more modern examples. So maybe, Drew, we could engage a little bit with some ancient examples that were sort of pivotal in the growing of the church in the Roman Empire.
Yeah, so well, it's interesting where to start from. So from early on in the church's life, we have this rhythm of sacrament giving, which comes up over and over again throughout church history as regards responding to these sort of crises. But the question is always, how can the sacrament be delivered? How can we maintain people's connection to their spiritual life through the giving of bread and wine, and in particular situations like global pandemics, health crises, that becomes more and more difficult. We can think of times like war, where it's a different kind of crisis, and churches don't necessarily have to shut down. People can still make it in and have that sort of respite, whereas in these health crises, we don't have that option as much. And so that's something that comes up sort of from ancient examples all the way through to modern examples.
And some of the ancient secular historians, or Jewish historians, Roman historians, they recorded, especially in one of the plagues that ravaged ancient Rome, which is said to have killed nearly a third of the Roman population, and that one of the things that they remarked upon on Christians was their willingness to care for the sick at risk to their own health, but also to hold funerals and to bury the sick. Because so often in the big cities, Rome and Corinth, that the dead were just left in mass graves, but the Christians took it upon themselves, not knowing the health implications, but to bury the dead. And that's part of where the last rites comes from. As one of the sacraments in the Catholic tradition is to give the dead and the dying the dignity to die well. And that was one of the very early examples from ancient times where Christians were proximate to the dying. And I'm not sure what that would mean for our context today, but it was one of the key markers that led to the growth of the church in ancient Rome, was how Christians cared for the sick and dying during some of the major plagues there around 50 AD or so.
Yeah, there's an important point there about the ethical imperative of loving your neighbor, and then also the ethical imperative of considering the other better than yourself, which is something we hear Jesus talking about. And in that, we get this idea of like sacrificing your own health, or maybe your own happiness or your own security or whatever that is, for someone else. So being willing to conduct funerals or bury the dead, even in ancient examples, in instances where there would be so much uncertainty of contracting whatever had contributed to those people dying, or all kinds of things like that. So that sort of sacrificial ethical theme comes up in Christian responses.
And I think the sacrifice for us today in the COVID situation is not proximity, it's distance. It's in saying that our sacrifice is the convenience of our daily lives, our routine, that we're willing to be at home, be a little bored, be a little frustrated, for the love of those that aren't, don't have a strong immune system, they have pre-existing conditions, that our sacrifice is actually staying at home, not engaging, not seeing our friends or family for a little while, and just distancing ourselves from any possible kind of transmission.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because just exactly that decision-making process we could see pretty clearly in some documentation from around the time of the Spanish flu, 1918, 1920, where there were drastic measures taken across the globe to close down mass gatherings, including church gatherings. And I read an article, which we can send out with the post, about newspaper articles that were documenting what churches were doing. And it's kind of all over the board. It's like, clearly there are some churches who took it upon themselves to close their mass gatherings and find other ways to engage with people on a spiritual level. So there were churches that were contacting local newspapers and publishing sermons in the newspaper for people to then read at home, because the newspapers are still going out. We don't work in newspapers as much anymore, but it's kind of thinking about that. And then there were other churches on the other side that were sort of just flaunting their own their beliefs against the government's decision to mandate that mass gatherings didn't happen. So there were newspaper clips of pastors being arrested mid-sermon because the police had come into a church gathering where people were just all huddled inside of a small sanctuary like this, and gathered together in such a small space. And so the police come in and shut it down, and pastors are getting arrested. You're just kind of going, well, there are a lot of ethical things that are going into that, but we see even 100 years ago, people on both sides of that sort of decision-making spectrum.
And I think it's so that we see the parallels today, is that our Facebook Live is our newspaper alternative, and there are pastors that are saying we have faith, we don't need to be fearful, we can meet together. And similarly, you're like, just the wrestling with how we as Christians are represented by people on the whole spectrum, and what sort of role do we play in articulating a balance between faith and prudence, and sort of a sensible middle ground of not pandering to fear, but also taking all the necessary precautions. And how as Christians what can we actively do other than just kind of stay at home in this time?
Yeah, so I'd love to hear your thoughts, Jordan, because I see those. I'm speaking about contemporary examples now. I've seen pastors, having church services on Sundays and saying, we won't be driven by fear. We won't give in to fear. We are a people who claim the mandate of the Bible, do not be afraid. I've seen that sort of float around Twitter and Facebook and all kinds of places. And I tend to think to myself, this is a sort of false choice. That either we are faithful or we're fearful is the kind of dichotomy that gets set up when a pastor or whoever kind of frames it in that way. I don't think that by staying home, by taking this social distancing thing on board for ourselves, that we are acting out of fear. I don't feel fearful myself. I wonder, do you feel like you're afraid or acting out of fear in order to practice social distance?
No, not at all. I even think it's an act of faith to say that, or we know that we have to rely on our higher power to sustain our needs for connection, for community in this time of distance. And I think it's not faith, it's just reckless, it's stupidity and it's reckless to say that God will protect us if we gather 500 people in a sanctuary and encourage them all to shake hands. It's just dumb. Yeah. And those pastors should be put in jail or fined. It's just ridiculous. And it's such an endangerment to public health. And I think it's just a complete disconnect with that faith is almost like a trump card to any sort of intellectual reasoning that you have. Sure. And I think that we have to have a balance to say that we've got to exercise this gift that we've been given. But I think it also, and this is maybe more from the British perspective, is that it kind of shows the very individualistic view we have of that God will protect me because I have faith. Sure. And there's no real kind of wrestling with, well, what does this mean for community? And I think it's South Korea is a great example. South Korea is statistically more people go to church there than anywhere else in Asia.
And in fact, one of the early clusters in South Korea centers around a church.
There's one lady who, I can send an article out, she's called Patient 31, and the Korean government have tracked her, and they think that she is solely responsible for infecting 1,130 plus people. Yeah. Singing in a church choir, hugging, kissing, all that. But I think that they were, the more kind of collectivist culture that they have, that say, I am Jordan, but I'm also Korean, is that you belong to a much wider whole. So they're much more ready to say that, we'll pause on all these things more quickly, more readily. And I think that there's the sort of the pioneering spirit of America at times that is the sort of the swashbuckling sort of pioneer attitude is that we're deeply individualistic. And I think this sort of exposes that. And especially a lot of the chat that's happened around, I don't know if you heard the Lieutenant Governor of Texas this week say that he would be willing to sacrifice his life for his grandkids and for the economy. So little how just these mad things that this whole pandemic has exposed about sort of the American psyche and what we value has been really fascinating to observe. And there's similar tensions back home in Scotland, maybe not quite as pronounced, but I think it definitely is exposing what are the things as a society that we really do value, and the government yesterday or this morning in the late hours of last night passed a $2 trillion bill. Sure. And it's in a couple of weeks. And and you think about the bills that take years and years and years to pass. That is when the circumstances really dictate that action needs to happen now. It can actually happen. Yeah. So I think there's lots of interesting lessons to learn that when there is a genuine crisis, there is a camaraderie that can happen, but it also shows just a deep-rooted individualism that is at the heart of a lot of Western culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that's right, and sort of just returning to that faith and fear dichotomy reminds me so much of the temptation of Jesus. Mark chapter 2, 3, 4, not exactly sure, but when the devil tempts Jesus at the top of the temple to throw yourself off, and the angels will catch you. Jesus' response is, "Thou shalt not put the Lord your God to the test." Which to me strikes me as exactly what pastors and others are doing by saying we're all going to meet together and we've got faith that the Lord will protect us,
right.
is just tempting God to have to save you. Right. You know, it's that idea of we will ignore all reason and common sense around our knowledge of this virus and how it spreads and its effects, and we will just force God's hand to protect us. And then if God doesn't protect us, then what's, I mean, the logical conclusion of this is ridiculous, which is why Jesus doesn't accept the devil's temptation at the top of the temple, because that is what would happen. Jesus sort of recognizes almost that he could throw himself off the temple and that the angels would catch him, where he'd be unharmed somehow or whatever. You know, maybe he makes an Iron Man landing at the bottom of the temple, who knows? But Jesus responds by saying that would be putting God to the test. And that it strikes me as exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So we wanted to just give space to talk about the current situation. And I know that we are just all consumed by COVID-19 and our Twitter feeds, our news when we turn it on. So we felt like we couldn't not talk about it for this initial sort of video on Adult Sunday School. But next week we're going to be sending out a video once a week. And we're going to engage more with some of the Easter themes, because we might not necessarily have that with our sermons. So we're going to try to like really kind of pick at some of the underlying themes and currents of the Easter story as we move towards a virtual Easter. But it's been great to kind of chat a little, and hopefully we can get some engagement with the regulars in the email, and we look forward to a time where we're together again. And if there's anything you would like us to discuss about Easter, or maybe even beyond that during this time, please send me or Drew an email, and we gladly kind of put some thoughts together on that. Any more thoughts, Drew, before we wrap up?
No, just to say it's really a joy to be able to be with you virtually. We would love to hear back from you if you have comments on any of these videos. We'd love to hear from you. If you've got pushback or complaints, you can reach me at jordan@gompc.org, and all of those complaints can go right into that inbox. But no, just to be serious, we love being able to just interact with you in whatever ways we can, and we would love to hear back from you, so this be as much of a conversation as it can over this virtual medium.
Stay safe and take care.